Welcome everyone. My name is Fraser. I'm currently student rep on Young Labour's National Committee, and I'm running to be chair of the new Labour students alongside the Socialist future slate of candidates. I'm going to be chairing today's event on justice for the global south, tackling climate chaos, ending the debt and vaccines for all as part of Arise festivals and the Lefty Lunchtime series. If you haven't already, I would really recommend getting a ticket for the whole festival. So I'd just like to say that for us as Young Labour Committee and the Socialist Future Campaign, our socialism is inseparable from internationalism and anti-imperialism. We believe that our struggles here for control of our work, against climate breakdown, and for a society organised to meet needs, not profit, are indivisible from the struggles of working class people across the global south. So it's a real pleasure to be chairing an event with speakers who share that vision. Today, we're joined by Dearden from Global Justice Now, Heidi Chow from Debt Justice, Zoe Cohen from Just Stop Oil, and Asad Rehman, later on, I think, from War on Want, to discuss vaccine apartheid, the global climate, and debt crises. As we're buffeted by another wave of COVID-19 here, we see the price of our food and energy soar and our debts pile up. It's important to remember that the particularly brutal costs of these crises for millions of people across the global south. As the climate crisis erodes access to food for millions, the grain shortage triggered by the war in Ukraine is just a foretaste of where climate breakdown will lead us. These food systems run on capitalist lines, produce more than enough for everyone, yet leave 800 million people in hunger. Their organization makes pandemics all the more likely, and when they arrive, pharmaceutical companies, backed up in Britain by the Tory party, would sooner subject millions in the global south to deadly illness than dent their intellectual property rights or profits. Faced with these crises, people and governments in the global south are often blocked from following different paths of development by debt burdens foisted on them by financial interests and institutions such as the IMF, which keep them locked into dependency on American and British capital. Governments in Britain leash to those interests, whoever the Prime Minister is, perpetuate this global injustice because it is the condition for their wealth and power. So as today's session goes on, please do think about this. Think through the questions that we need to explore and post these in the comments below the stream on YouTube so we can put them to our panel. And please let us know where you're tuning in from as well. So to kick off, the speakers will each introduce themselves before we move on to some discussion and questions. And I'll turn over to Nick to begin.
Thanks very much, Fraser, and thanks to the Arise Festival. I completely agree, and I've spent all of my life arguing that internationalism has got to be at the heart of how we confront power in the world and how we change the world, because the crises we're facing cannot be dealt with in this country acting alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the inequality of access to COVID medicines, because I think it gives us an insight into how the global economy works and how we need to change it. So at the moment, across the African continent, about 20% of people have been vaccinated. If you just look at low-income countries, the very poorest countries, you're looking at less than 15% of people. And that's quite high compared to where those figures have been. I mean, for much of last year, I mean, basically, there were very, very few. Some countries had none at all. Figures in single digits at a time when we had more vaccines than we could use. And indeed, we've since found out the governments threw quite a lot in the bin. And I think what makes this situation even more obscene is that it wasn't just the selfishness. It wasn't just the hoarding of the vaccines that we produced, whereby some countries like Britain bought several times what they needed while others couldn't get hold of any. But actually, there was no reason why we couldn't have produced many more vaccines, why many of the countries that were suffering from a severe shortage couldn't have produced their own vaccines. They had the manufacturing capacity to do that, except for the fact that a handful of transnational corporations wanted to keep control of the recipes and of the underlying technology. Much of that technology, by the way, they hadn't even invented. It was done largely thanks to the public sector and the public purse and our tax money, but we foolishly handed it over to them, as is quite normal in medicine production. And they were absolutely determined to sit on that important life-saving know-how so that they could extract as much value, as much profit from it as possible. We had governments like the Bangladeshi government saying we could be producing hundreds of millions of vaccines a year if we just share the recipe, if we just override the intellectual property rules that allow you to sit on this on these recipes, and they refused to do it. I mean, in South Africa, there's a great example of a World Health Organization-backed research and development facility that said we want to create an mRNA vaccine, we want to share it with everybody who has the capacity to make it around the world. They asked Pfizer, they asked Moderna, and they flat out refused to cooperate with them. And no wonder, because this year Pfizer expects to make $50 billion off its vaccine and its antiviral pill. Moderna has several of its executives become billionaires, precisely because of this vaccine technology. So that's the world we're living in, where some people's right to become a billionaire trumps the right of billions of people to safety, to security, and in some cases even to life. It's a very depressing state of affairs, but to give some hope, this did not go uncontested. So we were part of the People's Vaccine Campaign that challenged these rules to property, to the rights of the super rich, ahead of human life. And we received phenomenal amounts of support, and many governments around the world were utterly shocked by how they were just kind of left to the market, left to the wonders of the market, left to their own devices. And there's a real battle going on now across the African continent to challenge this model. So the mRNA hub I described in South Africa, it said, well, Pfizer won't share, Moderna won't share, to hell with them. We're just going to try and produce this ourselves. And they did in a matter of a few months. They overcame all these racist assumptions that you simply can't make this stuff in Africa. Of course you can. South Africa has done that, and it has begun sharing this revolutionary technology, which could help not only COVID, but they're talking now about vaccines for HIV, for tuberculosis, for certain types of cancer. Africa has now got a foothold in that technology. So I think, we've got to the point where it's really clear that our corporate dominated market knows best global economy isn't providing us with the technologies and innovations we need to live a good life. Far from it. It's preventing us from being able to use that know-how in a way that could create a more equal and sustainable world. And that's not just vaccines, it's not just medicines. Think of the food crisis that Fraser mentioned now gripping parts of the world. We cannot continue putting the rights of big agricultural monopolies and speculators ahead of the right to every person in the world to food. Yet we have a global economy that embeds that right, and we have to overturn that. Think of climate change. We can't have a global economy that puts the right of big corporations to hoard and monopolize technology over the ability of the planet to overcome climate change. But we have a global economy that embeds those rules, and we have to overturn that. And the scale of the fight that we're engaged in is therefore enormous. I think neoliberalism is breaking down. The idea that the market can solve all of our problems is breaking down. We saw that in COVID. Western governments spent and intervened and planned, not necessarily in the way we'd like them to, but nonetheless, they were quite clear the market wasn't going to get us out of this crisis. Yet most countries in the world are still forced to rely and depend on market mechanisms for what they need. And so I think the fight we've got ahead of us now is a fight between a world dominated by big corporations and the super rich, and becomes increasingly authoritarian because this world is not compatible with democracy in any way that we would, meaningful way that we would understand it. Or do we fundamentally change these rules and create a properly democratic, equal and sustainable planet? And we might all have different words for the type of world we want to see, but I think the starkness of the phrase barbarism or socialism is really very fitting for where we are at the moment. So the task ahead of us it sounds huge, it is huge, but I think there are real reasons for hope. Just to finish, I found working on the People's Vaccine Campaign, it was very interesting when you asked the public, the general public, whether they voted Labour, Liberal, Tory, Green, or whatever, there was a majority in every category for waiving intellectual property in the middle of a pandemic. Everybody thought it was obscene that if you can vaccinate everyone in the world, you refuse to do so because the profits of big business are more important than that. And so I think we have a real chance to sway public opinion and to bring people over to our side, and to create a new form of internationalism, which has got to be at the heart of the social change that we're all about. So thanks for this session, and look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Nick, for those really, really insightful comments. Heidi, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Fraser. Thanks, Nick. That's great. I think that, yeah, I'm going to speak about debt. The issue of debt is so interconnected with the fight for a global economy that works for all. And right now, there is a debt crisis that is engulfing the global South. 54 countries are in a debt crisis. And what we mean by debt crisis is that essential resources are being diverted away from healthcare, education, and tackling the climate crisis just to make debt repayments, often to banks and hedge funds that are set to make huge profits if they're paid back in full. And this current debt crisis that we've been seeing has been brewing for over a decade, and debt repayments are now at their highest levels since 2001. And as Fraser said at the beginning in the intro, things are set to get worse. The global economic climate is rapidly worsening. We're seeing food and fuel prices surge, creating even more pressure for countries that are struggling to make ends meet. Global South countries are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and with the absolute failure of the global North to deliver climate finance to meet the scale of the challenge, countries are being forced into debt just to tackle the climate emergency and build resilience. And without loss and damage funding, debt is also being used to respond to climate disasters like floods and hurricanes. And as Nick has said, back to the vaccine apartheid that we've seen has meant that countries like the UK and US and countries in Europe are living without restrictions, but many countries are still dealing with the aftermath of the impacts and the economic disruption from the pandemic. And so the only way to release resources immediately to help countries facing these multiple intersecting crises is to cancel their debt, and in the longer term, change the debt system so that we can prevent these debt crises occurring again and again. Now, a common reaction to debt cancellation is that, shouldn't countries pay their debts? But we always say that actually the massive accumulation of debt that we're seeing is a systemic problem. It's our global economy that's long been organized in the interest of corporations and wealthy governments, with its roots in colonialism. But even after independence, these interests have been continued to be sustained by the behaviours and activities and the policies of rich governments and their allies in corporations. So things like corporate tax avoidance and evasion, illicit financial flows, repatriation of profits, and unfair trade rules. The totality of these policies has essentially diverted income away from lower income countries and into the hands of rich governments and corporations. And collectively, these policies have kept global South economies locked into a colonial style economy, where we see the extraction of raw materials to fuel industrialization and profitability in the global North. And the UN has said that over 101 countries are still dependent on the export of raw materials. So this means that global South countries are really are hugely vulnerable to the volatility of global commodity markets. And it means that ultimately they've struggled to build diversified, resilient economies. And so global South countries are forced to use debt to publicly finance crucial areas of spending like healthcare, education, and fighting the climate crisis. In the 1970s, there was a really big push on lending to the global South, partly because the banking system was awash with OPEC oil, awash of cash from the OPEC oil crisis. And then loans became a really convenient weapon of the Cold War. And as countries went through the debt crisis of the 1980s, 1990s, the IMF and World Bank lent money and essentially bailed out the banks and the hedge funds from their risky, irresponsible lending. And these loans came with policy conditions, both during the 80s and 90s and even to this day, where we see these conditions being used to really powerfully control and shape the economies of the global South to continue to serve the corporate and imperial interests of the global North. And economies were forced to implement policies of austerity and privatization, liberalization and deregulation, essentially shaping these economies so that they were geared up to export, to earn money, to repay debts. And these policies have only kept global South countries continue to be underdeveloped and has increased the power of multinational corporations that have prevented global South countries from developing the same way that Northern countries had decades before. So across Latin America, Africa, these policies, these one-size-fits-all prescriptions means that economies essentially shrank and ultimately debt's been increasing, continue to increase as a percentage of GDP. And so the rules of what we see is that actually the rules of this global economy has essentially stitched up the global South. So now we have a situation where global South countries are structurally predisposed to harmful levels of debt. And all it takes is an external shock to plunge these countries into a debt crisis. And so that's what's been happening. Now it's been happening again and again in the past decade, as we've seen debts build up again. Lending increased after the financial crash of 2008. As speculators started looking for better returns for their money, they went to the global south as interest rates plummeted in the West. In 2014, the commodity prices collapsed. And so because countries are so dependent on raw material export, essentially their incomes collapsed. And so were forced to borrow to get by. And then the COVID-19 hit, and then that turbocharged what was already a growing problem of debt in the global south. And the G20's response was to set up a scheme called the Common Framework to try to have some sort of debt cancellation scheme. But so far, only 3 countries have applied, and no countries have had any debts cancelled whatsoever. And the real big barrier to having any debts cancelled is actually the banks and hedge funds, because they're essentially refusing to take part. So private lenders make up almost half of all the debt owed by lower income governments. So not having them play ball is a massive block on any progress on debt cancellation. It also means that, and not only does it mean that a bulk of the debt is untouched, but it also means that other lenders like governments and IMF and World Bank, they become reluctant to cancel debt, because anything that they cancel would just release funds to pay private lenders, basically to bail them out, essentially. So what can be done about all this? So we're calling for the debt to be cancelled. Countries who are experiencing unpayable debt right now, actually the only way out is debt cancellation. And so the stumbling block, like I said, are private creditors, they're banks and hedge funds. And the only way to put pressure on them is to have the credible threat of not being paid. But global south countries are often fearful of defaulting, of not paying, because of the fear of being politically ostracized, by the fear of kind of being tarred as a global pariah. And so this needs political and financial support from Western governments, from IMF, to support global south countries to not pay up, basically, essentially, to banks and hedge funds. But another concrete way to get banks and hedge funds to the table to negotiate debt cancellations is also through legislation. Actually, 98% of the debt contracts across the world are actually either written in UK law or New York law. And actually, we're pushing right now, alongside allies in New York, to push for new legislation to force these private lenders, these banks and hedge funds, to come to the table to negotiate debt restructuring and debt cancellation. And then over the longer term, we're also fighting for an independent process for debt cancellation. But these are the steps that I've outlined are just the ones that are specifically needed to deal with that debt crisis right now. But ultimately, we need to see the problem of debt as a crisis of the global economy itself. We've talked about how there's a system based on neocolonialism. It's going to be, the rules are all stitched up and rigged in the interests of rich governments and their allies with wealthy elites and corporations. And so ultimately, we need to oppose the underlying economic system. And so that's why I'm really excited to be on this panel today to talk about the different aspects and the different movements that we need to bring together to expose this system and build broad movements for change. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that explanation of the dimensions of the global debt crisis. And of course, we know that throughout history, societies have used debt jubilees to resolve debt crises. So this is nothing new that you're calling for. Zoe, would you like to come in now?
Thanks, Fraser, and thank you, Nick and Heidi. It's wonderful to hear you and a privilege to be here. Really appreciate it. So I'm from Just Stop Oil, and Just Stop Oil is a coalition with one very, very simple, clear demand, and that's for the UK government to end all new licensing and consents for new fossil fuels in the UK. We're part of an international coalition called A22 across more than 12 countries in the global north, doing everything non-violently possible to force governments to take action and to play our part in this international and highly urgent transition. As we know, the UK government called itself a climate leader. That's a complete joke, isn't it? I'm sure everyone watching knows that's a complete joke. They are woefully failing. They're ignoring the International Energy Agency's very clear policy statement from more than a year ago that there can be no new fossil fuel projects globally from 2021 to have any hope of staying below 1.5 degrees. But what we actually know from the world's leading scientists who are prepared to speak the accurate science, like Sir David King, the former chief scientific advisor to the UK government, is that we're going to sail past 1.5 degrees by the end of this decade. and current policies are taking us to 3 degrees and above, which obviously is a hellscape. And what Sir David King also said last year at a conference in Australia was that in his view that we have 3 to 4 years to determine the future of humanity, and that was a year ago. We are absolutely out of time here. It couldn't be more urgent. So the UK government is failing on its own insufficient targets. And of course, well, I don't want to say of course, but I am saying of course, they are not factoring fairness and justice one bit into the actions that they are taking. There's woeful, pathetic actions that they are taking. So not only is the UK government failing and its climate action, along with pretty much every other government on earth, the impacts, of course, now are hitting the most affected people in areas right now, as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, from extreme heat across India and Pakistan, flooding in Bangladesh, 50 million people on the brink of starvation in Africa, and so on and so on and so on. The horror is right now, and not just in the global south, of course. It's nowhere is safe, no continent is safe. If this wasn't bad enough, the whole of the global north's climate policy is actually systemically racist and unjust, and it perpetuates colonial inequality in its very constructs. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the energy scenarios that it constructs within its very reports and projections, those scenarios maintain the global north's energy use at the ridiculous high levels that are the case now. That is fundamentally unjust and also catastrophic for humanity. This constrains the global north's ability to get a fairer share, but it also underpins the whole of our human survival and our society's survival on the reliance on negative emissions technologies, most of which aren't proven at scale, and a large part of which in the IPCC scenarios are bioenergy and carbon capture, which is basically growing crops and capturing the carbon from that. It's not been done at scale, but the scenarios that the IPCC talks about is using land in the global south to do this. I mean, it's compounding inequality and colonialism on itself. It's absolutely horrific, and I'm sure many people don't actually realize that this is the case. So we urgently need mitigation scenarios that represent the futures that we know are possible of justice, equity, and energy convergence, where the global north, we reduce our energy use to what is reasonable and fair for the planet, and our brothers and sisters around the world get to have a better life, get to have a life, frankly. We mustn't forget that 3.5 billion people are at high risk of climate impacts right now, which brings us back to the UK and the part that we must play. In the Just Stop Oil Coalition, we sincerely believe that the UK must play its part as a genuine leader, and we must resist new fossil fuels with all of our might, all of our peaceful might. And just as we have resist other unjust symptoms of this system and the elites' addiction to oil and gas, they're addicted to fossil fuels, aren't they, because of the power and the wealth that it gives them. And that's one of the big reasons that they don't want change to happen. But actually stopping new oil and gas is one of the most basic and first steps that has to happen. And it has to happen right across the board. So that's why we are set up to demand this one no-brainer demand from the UK government. And we have to, of course, together see this through the lens of the reality that we are in now. Everything that we care about is threatened. Our jobs, our pensions, our savings, our NHS, our public services, our food supply, everything is threatened by the complete collapse of society that is on the cards within the next 15 to 20 years, if not sooner, if we don't rein in the horror of oil and gas. And many, many more of us need to be prepared to take some level of personal risk, because that's what it's going to take, given what's at stake. Just Stop Oil supporters, more than 450 supporters of Just Stop Oil took action in different parts of the UK in April and successfully disrupted more than 50% of the fuel supplies to the country. Now, it's horrible to talk about this kind of disruption. No one likes causing it at all. But unfortunately, as I'm sure everyone knows here, civil resistance history shows that unless we cause meaningful economic disruption, we just don't get a look in. Very, very sadly, 4 supporters of Just Stop Oil are actually in prison right now as I speak, including a retired GP, someone who's has lived experience of fuel poverty, and a 21-year-old imprisoned by this government. Just Stop Oil are absolutely in solidarity with ordinary people everywhere, right across the world. We're in solidarity with communities of resistance in the global south, and we're in solidarity with all striking workers in this country. We know that there can be no peace and no justice whilst fossil fuels dominate our society and our economy and our politics. So we are really delighted to be in a coalition within the UK with the Peace and Justice Project and Fuel Poverty Action. Our coalition combined has a banner of "We all want to just stop oil," and I think my colleague in the background is sharing those links on YouTube with you. We're delighted to be in coalition, and we have a wonderful collective event happening in London on the 23rd of July, a national march. It's a low-risk action and be really open to everyone. All the details are on the website that I hope is being shared with you, and that we all want to we all want to just stop oil. Sorry, it's a slight mouthful. The coalition has 5 demands. The top one is no new oil and gas. Secondly is tax polluters and the billionaires. Energy for all, insulate our homes, which of course reduces bills, genuinely attacks the cost of living, reduces emissions and creates great jobs, and cheap public transport, which is totally essential to real levelling up across this country. So thank you for the opportunity to speak here. Everyone in this space knows that another world is possible. We all know that it doesn't have to be like the complete shit show that it is right now. Please do come together and join us. We'd love to see you on the 23rd in London. Thank you, Fraser.
Great, thank you so much, Zoe, for that important contribution on the colonial character of the crisis and also the absolute imperative to keep oil and fossil fuels in the ground and take direct action to do so. So finally, we're going to hear from Asad Rehman from Global Justice Now. Asad, do you want to come in?
Actually, one-on-one, Nick's from GGN.
So sorry,
Right.
yeah, apologies.
No, that's okay. Thanks, Fraser, and thanks to everyone organising the Rise Festival, and to Zoe and Nick and Heidi for their contributions. I'm always reminded at these moments of that quote by Antonio Gramsci, you know, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born in its time of monsters. And it clearly is a time of monsters and their violence, right? And these monsters don't hide in the shadows. They're not under our beds. They stand very, very clearly in front of us. Political leaders, the billionaire class, corporate giants, and of course, the biggest monster of all, our capitalist system and racialized capitalism through its genesis, whether it's been through slavery and colonialism, imperialism, to today's brutal neoliberalism that's predicated on sacrificing the poor, black and brown people in the global south and our planet, all in the pursuit of profit. And it's created not just a world riven with deep inequalities and inequities, but now a planet on which the question, can humanity survive, is a very real one. And, you know, we recently had the IPCC publish all its latest reports. And when you have even the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to describe it as an atlas of human suffering and an indictment, and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership, where he says governments are saying one thing but doing another. Put simply, they are lying and the results will be catastrophic. And as we've heard from Zoe, it's not just the UK, the European Union, the US are announcing even more of expansion of fossil fuels, and even going as far as to now say that gas and nuclear are green energy. Look, we all recognise that this idea that you could have incremental siloed climate action is just failing, and that delay, it means death. And when we're in a moment where every second counts and every degree matters, I think the question we should always start by asking ourselves is, why is it that so-called rational governments are unable to act? Why is it we have had decades of climate negotiations and if they've not delivered what is needed? And I think to understand that, you've got to really understand what sits at the very heart of so-called climate diplomacy. And there's been just one overriding concern. It's not the 3.5 billion people who are highly vulnerable to the climate crisis, the same people who are locked into poverty, who don't have access to electricity or clean cooking, or the 2.5 billion people affected by water scarcity, and that will increase. It's not our ecosystems that, as the IPCC said, are on the point of no return and will collapse. And these are the critical ecosystems that underpin the lives and livelihoods of the majority of people in the world. And they're from everything from access to water, fresh water, to food production. All that fact that many countries in the global south are already overwhelmed by this permanent crisis. And we've heard from Heidi from debt, from inequality, from Nick about COVID, and of course from the climate crisis. And that overwhelming, this permanent crisis for the global south is, of course, built on that, as we've heard, this colonial extraction of resources and exploitation of people, and it's overwhelmed the ability of countries to even begin to protect their citizens. The main overriding concern of climate diplomacy is actually protecting the neoliberal economy. And I'm just reminded, always of that 2 degrees target that is embedded into this Paris Agreement. It was plucked out of thin air. It has no basis in science or justice. In fact, it was determined by a neoliberal economist, no doubt, who he actually calculated that on a cost-benefit analysis, and for which he got a Nobel Prize, by the way, he calculated that the optimum level of warming was 4 degrees. And what was at the center of that, of course, was that the interests of capital meant more than the lives of people and our planet. And even Sir Nicholas Stern, the renowned economist who wrote The Economic Costs of Tackling Climate Change, he said climate was the greatest failure of the free market. It didn't say that it was the problem was not capital and not profit accumulation, not the unequal and unsustainable extraction and consumption of resources. He said it's simply that capital needed to internalize the externalities. That if we put a price on everything, then the market would continue to make rational decisions. And that's, of course, at the heart of this new wave of so-called green capitalism. And we see it now, right? Every part of life, every part of nature is commodified. You put a value on whales, on elephants, trees, and people. Yet even try and put a price on, of course, what is priceless, the right of people to live and to survive. And they calculate that cost. And what's interesting is even when they calculate the cost of all of those, of so-called, of the world itself, it doesn't meet the cost of the assets of the biggest companies in the world. And that's why where you have even the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights warning, this is climate apartheid. The rich are using their wealth to seek safety and they're leaving the poor to burn. And that, as we've heard, is exactly what is happening. But they're not only allowing the poor to burn, but they're actually then denying people in the global south the ability to be able to even protect their own citizens. And we saved that from Nick. When you put profits of big pharma ahead of people's health, how will they act when, as Pakistan suffers a heat wave of 53 degrees, or millions of people are starving from climate famine, or countries in the global south have every school, hospital and road destroyed just from one storm? When we know that the impacts of 1.5 are irreversible, we're heading towards at least a warming of 2.7 degrees. And that is if every single pledge by every single country is met. And as we can see, we're heading in totally the wrong direction. Look, we have at best a decade left for 1.5, potentially another 1 or 2 for 2 degrees. And as already spelled out, every rich country, including the UK, is promoting this idea of net zero 2050. Not only carbon colonialism, but gambling that we can somehow dial back temperatures through unproven, risky and dangerous technologies. It's simply another license to pollute, not just for the fossil fuel industry, but for industrial agribusiness. And for the climate justice movement, it's always been clear that the climate crisis is an intersected crisis of economic, racial, gender and social injustice, that it's our systems of our exploited ecosystems of resource extraction and unsustainable economic growth that is the driving force behind this crisis. And of course, it determines who faces the worst impacts. And the IPCC even spells that out. It says 15 times more vulnerability if you're in the global south than in the global south. And when the IPCC itself says, look, these vulnerabilities are determined through this marginalization of race and class and combinations. And it says that these vulnerabilities are resulting from challenges faced by influence by historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism. We have to ask ourselves, if the world's climate scientists are saying that these are the systems of oppression, of colonialism that determine who lives or dies, why isn't that the language of the climate movement and of climate and of society as a whole? Look, yeah, I know I don't have very long, but the climate scientists said very, very clearly, the world we live in today, as unequal and unjust as it is not the world we will live in 10 or 20 years. We have a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So our starting point should be, we should be absolutely filled with anger, right, about this moment. But we should also be filled with hope, right? Because there is hope, right? There is hope that in this moment of time and monsters, that actually the antidote to that is exactly the politics of universalism, of solidarity, of cooperation, of internationalism, of recognizing that actually we can have a planet where everybody can live with dignity and in harmony with that planet. But that fundamentally means we have to change the world we live in. And we know through history that transformation is only possible if we build our power and our collective power. And that means weaving our movements together. It means weaving our issues and our demands together. Now, these aren't just as niceties and abstract. It means actually recognizing that when we say for people to have the right to live with dignity, that's not simply about stopping the climate crisis. It means the right for everybody to have a living wage, to have access to universal public services, to social protection. It means cancelling unsustainable debt, but going beyond that, and repairing the harm that has been done through centuries of colonial exploitation. That means the reparations and returning the finance and tech that has been saluted from the global south. It doesn't mean the answer is aid. We don't need more aid. For every dollar in aid that flows from the north to the south, $24 flows the other way through illicit capital flows, exploitation, debt repayments, etc. What we need is a new way of looking at our economy, one that's built on sufficiency, and built on sufficiency requires an equitable distribution of the world's resources. And that can only be done through cooperation and solidarity. So I want to say, for us as a movement, we can no longer say that climate justice is something we tack onto our banners or leaflets. It means of taking a radical anti-colonial lens to look at this crisis and recognize it's only possible to be solved through radical transformative action. And that the challenge for us now, for the present and the future, is changing political will. And political will and this deadly status quo can only be challenged by collective power. So for the build of social license, for a justice transition, we must weave together our moments. So often when we talk about the climate crisis, it's too much about the doom. And of course, we have to speak about the realities, but we also have to begin to explain and spell out the vision of the world we want to create. As War on Want and as our partners and movements all around the world, we call for a radical global Green New Deal. Equitable response to tackling 1.5. That means energy and food need to be a public good, equitably distributed. It means the UK and rich countries need to be decarbonising by 2030. But it also means that we have to live in a world with planetary limits. That means challenging the very idea of unsustainable growth and consumption. Now, that's not about less. That's about better. That's about redistributing wealth and resources from those who hoard to those who need. And it begins to spell out a different world, a world where actually we can live with joy and with humanity and being connected. And only if we, at this moment, make that decision to be on the side of people and planet and justice, will this new world that we all desire, can we birth it? But that is ultimately going to be up to us as people and not up to our corporations and governments. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Asad, for that incredible long view of racial capitalism driving climate apartheid and the necessity for that fundamental social and ecological transition, decarbonising and decommodifying basic public goods. Really incredible. So thank you to all of the speakers so much for what have been a really incisive, honest, but also hopeful set of contributions. So if you have any questions, feel free to please put them in the YouTube comments. But in the meantime, I do have a few for our speakers to address. please do feel free just to speak to the ones that are kind of most relevant to you and that you've got something to say something on. So just first of all, both the failure to tackle climate change and the inability to vaccinate the whole world are linked to the desire of private multinational billionaires to make huge profits. Do these crises show that they have more power than elected governments, or what is the relationship between their power and the state? Another question, just so we can kind of go through them. Could you comment on the global refugee crises and what our government should be saying and doing, and what our demands should be as the left in Britain? And then finally, just one more question. COP26 being such a failure has disillusioned some with the power of climate protests to make a difference. Are there global movements you see today that you think have the power to shift the situation, such as in the United States or Brazil? Who would like to come in on one of those? Zoe.
Sorry, Fraser, could you just repeat the first one? I missed it, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, no. Both the failure to tackle climate change and the inability to vaccinate the whole world are linked to the desire of multinationals to make huge profits. Do these crises show that they have more power than elected governments, or what is the relationship between their power and the state? Great. Zoe, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I'll just touch on sort of one aspect of that first question about corporates and governments. And I guess it sense people might in this country target like the likes of BP and Shell, but of course it's the government that grants the licenses. Without those licenses, the new, never mind the existing wells, etc., the BP, Shell and all the other petrochemical companies, oil companies, they can't actually exploit new sites without the licenses. So that permission comes from the government. Now, of course, they effectively buy the government, don't they? Because there's a revolving door. Nadeem Zahawi earned 1.3 million from his side job in an oil company, and Priti Patel's taken £100,000 donation from someone connected to oil. So they buy them, but at the same time, it is the governments that actually grant those licenses. So hence our demand is very much targeted at the government. And I think there is something around working in civil resistance, and as Asad said, joining and finding our collective power so that we can help reach them these social tipping points, and we can make the idea of fossil fuels per se, and especially the idea of new fossil fuels, a totally toxic idea and totally socially unacceptable. And there's so many things we need to make unacceptable, like debt. These things need to be unacceptable to the population, so that that special thing called political will can be created, as you absolutely rightly said, Asad. It's unfortunately we can't go to Tesco's and buy half a pound of political will. I wish we could, but we have to create it, and we have to make these toxic things genuinely socially toxic.
Great, thank you so much. Asad, did you want to come in?
I think Nick had his hand up,
so
I'm happy to go after Nick.
Yeah, whatever order. I mean, it's absolutely true. Corporations now have more power than most governments in the world, but they actually work hand in glove with the governments in the West, because those are the governments that have given them that power. I mean, that power has been embedded in global economic rules that have been created in my lifetime. Right? We haven't had this forever. Now, that's not to say the economy of the 60s and 70s was perfect. It was a long way from perfect. It was still very colonial and so on. But what happened from the late 70s onwards was this turbocharged capitalism that was brutally pro-corporate and colonial in the way that it operated. And basically, these people just rewrote the rules of the global economy to suit in their own image, to suit their own interests. And that's where you have things like TRIPS, the intellectual property agreement that protects the pharmaceutical companies, but also any company that's sitting on patents, most of which are publicly created anywhere, and can use that agreement to say, well, our rights to profit account for more in the world than your people's right to food and healthcare does. And that's just, we can't get anywhere until we tear those rules down. And I think, that sounds massive, but actually we are in a period now where I think it's clear to so many people that system has failed them. Where, the right to make profit is actually being put ahead even of the stability of the system itself. I mean, even of our right, our ability to live on a habitable planet anymore. But that doesn't mean that things are just automatically going to go our way. And that's where the people's power that Asad and Zoe and everyone have talked about, comes in. There has been in my lifetime one major challenge to this system, and that was the governments of Latin America in the late 90s and 2000s who said we're going to do things in a different way. They weren't perfect, but they began creating their own institutions and systems and rules and way of doing things, and just said corporations cannot do what they want in our countries anymore. And that was very powerful. That was snatched away from us, but there is another wave, I think, in Latin America happening now. We've got to watch what happens in Brazil very closely in coming months. Not because Lula's our savior, but because that election has the ability to shift power in Latin America fundamentally. And I think if that happens, then hopefully we will begin to grow a solidarity movement again, like we had in the late 90s and early 2000s, that can begin shifting power everywhere in the world and can simply begin removing that power from corporations, because we have the ability to do that if we build enough collective power, and we have to do it if we want to have a livable and habitable and fair world and planet. And very briefly on the refugees, I mean, we must create safe, legal routes for people who are fleeing not only war and political persecution, but dispossession and poverty and inequality. We have to do that because we're human beings, but we particularly have to do it because, frankly, our governments and our corporations have created the conditions that those people are fleeing from. So we've got to stop them doing that, obviously, but if in the meantime there is an immediate need that we have to offer sanctuary and safety to people who've been negatively affected by the same system that is causing such poverty and crisis here as well. And we've really got to try, and this can be really hard, but we've really got to try to prevent the divisions that our elites would like to sow among us as ordinary people around the world. We have far more in common with those people than we do with our elites. And if we want to build a fairer world, we've got to be on their side.
Thanks so much, Nick.
I'm happy to go next unless Heidi, you want to come in?
You go first, Asad. I'll go after you, Asad.
Okay, so maybe just, I absolutely agree with Nick. The question, change, it's coming, but that doesn't mean inevitable that the change is something that will be positive. In fact, we can see already that what their kind of change is going to look like, and it's best, we want an illustration of that. We only need to look at war and refugees, right? You have a war in Ukraine. It mirrors experiences of many people around the world, whether it be in Palestine or Eritrea or Yemen or Syria. Yet this universal issue of human solidarity, respect for international law, is mediated through lenses like those people who look like us. They're civilized. They're worthy of protection. Those who are black and brown, who we dehumanize, that's war for them is a natural state. This is the uncivilized third world, forgetting that actually we have fueled those crises, that you can have open European borders for fleeing the war in Ukraine, but barbed wire fences and state-sanctioned trafficking of people to Rwanda for those fleeing injustices that the West has fueled. So absolutely, this is a very, very central part. This is why we always say you cannot fight this climate crisis, you cannot fight any of these crises without being anti-imperialist, because at the core of being anti-imperialist is an understanding of how race and class and power is used. Now, what the answer to this global, and it is not a refugee crisis as such, it's a displacement crisis, right, of the poor being displaced from their homes. Now, the UN says 1 in 30 people will be displaced from their homes. So absolutely, as Nick said, we need safe routes for people to be able to seek safety. And that's not just from war and conflict, it's from the right to not to go hungry. It's the right not to be exploited. It's the right to be able to stay on their land. But at the same time, we have to also fight for the right of people not to move. And that fight of people not to move is what makes us have to take on the role of our corporations and our global and our country and their economic trade policies and tax policies, because that's what's displacing people. And people who are displaced, over 90% of those people who are displaced internally within poorer countries. And the solution to them is the same solution to the climate crisis and the crisis in inequality. Do you have income? Do you have access to public services? Do you have social protection? Do you have the right to housing, health and education? And these are the things that, of course, we fight for here in the UK, but have to be internationalized. That if we're fighting for them here, that we are also fighting for them at a global level. No longer can we say we retreat to the nation state and we're only interested in the class and ordinary people in this country. We have to say if we're fighting for these fights, they can be realized. And we know that they can be realized. We just a 2% tax of wealth of the richest billionaires is enough to finance public services all around the world, right? I mean, that's how little actually is needed. Well, we know from the actions of the government that if it can seize the assets of the Russian oligarchs, then we can seize the assets of the global billionaires and finance this transition. Secondly, in terms of on the COP26 and people who look at the COPs and say, well, they're failing. Look, the COP's failing like everything else is failing because it's a fundamental question about power. It's not the COP itself, it's about power. There are more forces inside the COP who have more power than we do, which is why we build power, why we build movements and throw them against the COP to express as a way of actually engaging more and more people. Right, of using that moment to politically educate people. So moving away from empty calls to governments saying, take action on climate, to actually being very, very explicit about what we want to do. Now, the problem is within this question about power of multinationals in the state is absolutely corporations now, yes, they've rigged the rules and the states, countries and governments have written the rules, but they are more powerful than many countries. And in fact, in the UN process now, the UN is basically saying the states are unable to deal with these crises and that the only answer are the corporations who created this crisis. So if you look into whether it's the summit on food, you look at the COP, what do you see? You see multinationals were being portrayed as basically going to be the saviors. The market will be the saviors. These corporations will be the answer. So to tackle that, of course, we have to be able to call and say, the very people who are burning the planet cannot be the people who are going to save this planet. And absolutely, that does require a challenge. Now, there's a challenge for countries in the global south because they say only when you in the global north are building internationalist movements, anti-imperialist movements that allow us the space to be able to build alternatives, are we going to actually be able to build the kind of alternatives that we need. But there is hope. Look, in Colombia, an incredible alliance of workers, environmental justice organizations, feminist Afro-Colombians have taken the government in one of the most right-wing countries that we have seen, where more environmental defenders are murdered each and every week than anywhere else in the world. And that is because they built a movement that then had a political expression. But at the center of that, what's really interesting is the new alliance is saying we're not going to rely on fossil fuels to build our new future. Well, what does a post-extractive future look like? When we look at Chile, the cradle of neoliberalism, and as the government in Chile said, now will be the graveyard of neoliberalism, right? A movement that was built not around, that was sparked by a protest around 30 pesos increase on subway trains, became about 30 years of neoliberalism. It is possible, but you've got to have the vision and the imagination. And one of the biggest victories of neoliberalism has been on our imaginations, that there was nothing before neoliberalism, there is nothing after neoliberalism. This is the end of history. And it's affected our ability to even say, when we say the word, another world is possible, to actually believe another world is possible. You can only transform what you believe you can actually do. And that means actually also recognizing the power we have as people. And for 30 years, neoliberalism has crushed the idea that we as ordinary people have any power. But actually, when we do look through history, when ordinary people do take to the streets, when we do organize, when we do have collective demands, not abstract just calls, but concrete demands, we can transform both our own country and globally. And I think that's this challenge that we face now, is rebuilding an internationalist and anti-imperialist movement.
Great, thanks so much, Asad. Heidi, do you want to come in? Some final thoughts?
Yeah, Yeah, I just want to sort of just very quickly respond to just how Asad finished that off about imagination, because I actually went to a movement building space convened by Neon last month, and actually we did this exercise where we had to do a visioning exercise and sort of think, where would the world look like? What would the world look like in 2030, 2035? And actually, to be honest, I really struggled with it. I thought realistically, it's going to be pretty much the same and a bit worse probably. And actually, I remember sharing that in the group, saying I actually really struggled with imagining what a different world could look like. And actually, through that session, actually, and I realized by saying that I was actually conceding to what neoliberalism wants me to do, and that is to kind of completely make us think that there is nothing else but this, and this is the law of nature, this is the way it has to be. And actually, I think it's really important that we don't lose the ability to imagine, because our imagination is our act of political resistance in a current context. So I just want to like encourage us to continue to not be the way I was like a month ago, where all I could see was this and way more worse, you know, in the years to come. Actually, we need to continue to hold that vision of what a world that we want to fight for to look like. And I think when we're thinking about power and the power of movement, power of people and the power of states, and seeing in the fights that took place at the World Trade Organization last month around the intellectual property waiver, and thinking about where the climate negotiations are at. Actually, I think that we do have to, we do come very, it brings us into really close reality to where the actual power of corporations and their allies in governments and wealthy elites, and the collusion of the elites in those spaces. And I feel like the only way we can kind of come against that is actually to counterbalance that with the power of movements, and actually building movements in the spaces that we work in, and building connections between our movements. So for example, I talked about debt earlier, and how actually there are movements rising up in Tunisia at the moment who are opposing their IMF austerity demands in Tunisia right now. The unions are coming together and opposing that. We're seeing Argentinians coming back onto the streets again, mobilizing against their government deal with the IMF. And so we're seeing these kind of we're seeing this resistance come up again. And actually, as UK campaigners and activists, we have a responsibility to build solidarity with those movements, and to amplify those demands and ensure that their voices and their demands are driving the work that we do. But also, I also think this moment of crisis where global South countries are struggling under the weight of inflationary demands around food and energy price hikes, actually that's precisely the very struggle that households are facing in the UK, that they are unable to meet their basic needs because of the worsening economic condition. And that's exactly the struggles that are being played out across the world. And so I think there's huge prospects there and potential to really build that solidarity across borders, across countries, and see ourselves as people of the world coming together to fight these common struggles that we all have. And I think that, I think a really important part of that is political education, that actually we need to, I feel like some of the conversations we have and our perspectives is very confined to our own bubbles, and we end up in a little echo chamber sometimes. So I really feel we need a real outward facingness about us as a movement, and actually think about how we talk about our issues, think about how we tell the story of our struggle and how it relates to everyday, how it relates to people's experiences, and to use tools that we have in our toolbox around political education, around outreach, movement building, community organizing, building power, and connecting all of those up into an internationalist movement that we can really create change together.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your contributions. I'm just going to say a few quick words before we come back to the speakers for a minute of summing up on the issues we've been discussing, if that's okay. I think it's really important, thinking about everything we've heard today, for us to recognize that these crises and problems are not just problems for other people over there in the global South. They are our problems. The Labour Party, the trade unions in Britain, no political force can address the crises we face and the threat they pose here without an unashamedly internationalist agenda, political horizon and movement. We really need to be raising these demands and discussing these issues, the issues raised by War on Want, Global Justice Now, Debt Justice, Just Stop Oil, and so many other groups. Wherever we're organising, we need to be discussing them. I know a lot of people listening today will be involved in the Labour Party, And it's actually really important that we raise these issues in our CLPs in local meetings, discuss them with members and share our knowledge that these struggles have to be ours as socialists, and rebuild the morale and commitment to see those struggles through, no matter the obstacles we face. We, as the Socialist Future candidates, we're running for Young Labour and Labour Students national committees because we want to do that within the party. So just a quick plug to say that if you're listening and you're a young or student member of the party, or if you know any, we would be immensely grateful if you could encourage them to support us. A note to say as well, for all the latest on all the campaigns we've discussed today, you can follow Arise's media partner, Labour Outlook, on Twitter and elsewhere. And please also take on board the action links that have been posted in the chat throughout, including by donating if you're able to, because that will allow Arise to keep hosting incredible events like this. The next Arise Festival event will be Monday at 7 p.m. on Johnson Has Gone, and now let's win a new deal for workers. So don't miss that. Finally, so we're going to go back to each of the speakers for a minute of summing up. We have had one more question from Ruth that it would be good if you could cover in your final comments, if possible. So Ruth has asked, can we do anything with local councils to push for climate justice, or is this a dead end? Net zero aims, greenwashing, and uniform statistics on carbon footprints don't reflect local social injustices. Nick, would you like to begin, and then we'll go in the same order?
Yeah, though I'll probably leave Ruth's question to Zoe and Asad, though I'm sure there is, at all levels, we need to fight this battle. But look, just two things from me. Fraser, you mentioned the Labour Party. Look, I mean, all of us, I think, worked, really hard in the last few years to get some amazing Labour policies in the 2019 manifesto. Everything that we've talked about today, there were really detailed policies, pharmaceutical reform, stuff around completely reforming international development, changing trade rules and so on. It's all in there. They've gone very quiet about some of these policies in the last couple of years. I think there's a huge job of work to do to defend and continue promoting and speaking about some of those policies and holding them to them, because so much work went into them. We have so many of the solutions and alternatives, and it's terrible that Labour isn't currently championing those policies. The second thing I just want to come back on, really, I think what Heidi was saying at the end there, which is there's going to be so much talk in this country of the cost of living crisis in coming months and years, and that's really important. Obviously, it's really important. I mean, people are struggling to an unbelievable degree in this country, and we've got to defend them. But let's also use that to talk about the cost of living crisis that's going on around the world already. I mean, the horrendous food crisis that's happening across Africa and elsewhere, the debt crisis that's decimating public services and driving down living standards around the world. This has got to be an international fight back, an international cost of living crisis that we're confronting. And I think it gives us, it's awful, but I think it at least gives us the format to begin creating those links across borders. And I think, it's great to have been part of this today and to begin making a start on this today. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nick. Heidi, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think what we've I think today there's been a lot of common themes that have come out, and I think our global economy has failed us on so many levels. It's failed us here in the UK domestically, with the lowest income households in this country being on the forefront of that. And that is exacerbated existing inequalities in our society, where the impact has fallen disproportionately, and especially around things like household debt, disproportionately on communities of colour and people with disabilities, people who are renting, people who are carers, and so on. And so we see that replicated, the impact of the failure of the global economy, not just like domestically in this country, but then also globally across the world, and especially in the global south. I think that I really want to encourage us not to lose our ability to imagine a better world, because we can because as bad as things are, we do have, we can build solidarity, we can build our power as a movement to challenge the fundamentally racist imperial colonial system that we have in the world right now. And ultimately, I feel like we cannot let that system win out. I think hold on to that imagination that we can build a better world together.
Amazing, thank you, Heidi. Zoe, would you like to come in?
Thanks, Fraser. Yeah, thanks, everyone. A specific on the local authorities thing and then a wider point. During the Just Stop Oil civil resistance actions in April, a number of injunctions were taken out to basically protect oil interests above our rights as citizens to peaceful protest and our rights for a future. And some of those injunctions were actually put in place by local authorities. I mean, how bonkers is that? And the local authorities declared a climate emergency. I mean, make sense of that. So, if you live in those areas, Warwickshire, I think is one of them, go target them, basically. Take your argument directly to them, direct action with those authorities, obviously peaceful and non-violent, but, that's an outrage, putting oil interests before their own citizens and citizens of this country. And on a wider note to just end, I think it is the point about maintaining our imagination is really, really crucial. And I know we say this stuff very often, but we have so much power, way, way more than we realize. And by coming together in even relatively small numbers, we can achieve incredible things. So I would really encourage people to, if they can, join us in London on the 23rd of July. We're working towards sustained civil resistance in August and in London in October. And, we have way more power than we realize, and taking action is an antidote for hopelessness. And you never know, we might actually change the course of history. So yeah, please, let's really come together right across this whole agenda, because we have a shared fight, shared peaceful fight. Thank you.
Such an important point. Thank you, Zoe. Asad, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just to reiterate, absolutely. I think you can never win, and you cannot transform until you have a vision of the world we are fighting for. So it's important for us to be using our imagination and being able to talk about that vision, but talk about it in a way that connects with people right around the jobs and justice and climate, and having political demands that take us there, right? Being very, very clear about that they have to be rooted in that sort of science, justice and anti-colonial principle. Look, we have the solutions, there's no question about it, but I think there's also something very important for us as a movement to understand. This, where we are now, is not about mobilizing people. It's about organizing people. And there's a big difference between mobilizing and organizing. Yes, we have to mobilize people at certain times, but what's critical is organizing people. And organizing people, as Heidi said, requires us to also do political education, to arm and our own movement with a depth and an understanding of these crises, and an ability to be able to communicate it in a way that is able to go out beyond our circles and connect. And as Nick said, the cost of living crisis is a reality. Of course, it's not just within the global north. It's actually a global crisis, but it's also an opportunity for us to be able to weave together our demands. There are two things I always bear in mind. One is that the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest in France, and their banner at the beginning of their protest, which was the elites worry about the end of the world, we ordinary people worry about the end of the month. We have to have an answer that says we worry about the end of the world and we worry about the end of the month, and that these two fights are absolutely interconnected. And I just want to end maybe with a quote from not somebody who's on our side, but I think is very, very telling about this moment. It's Milton Friedman, the architect of neoliberalism, who said only a crisis, real or perceived, produces real change. And our role is to keep our ideas alive until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. We have to keep our ideas alive, and we're the only ones who will make the politically impossible become the politically inevitable. And that's up to us.
Incredible. Thank you, Asad and Zoe and Heidi and Nick, and thank you everybody for coming along to this incredible event today. So many lessons and so much hope to take away. Love and solidarity, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Fraser.